With this video, I'd like to try something which is frankly experimental. I'm going to try and outline and then explore in more depth three of, as I see it, the main principal theories or models for the origins of homelessness, and to tease out from that the implications for services in terms of how we meet the psychological and emotional issues that arise for potential service users, those who find themselves homeless and come to the attention of homelessness services. And what I'm going to try is to do this, although we are going to be talking about probabilities and therefore graphs and elements of statistics, but I'm going to try and illustrate this without any use of PowerPoint slides whatsoever, or graphs, proper graphs, but using chopsticks. Other sticks are available. I just wanted a way of showing a straight line as you might on a graph. So a graph like this, and the straight lines intersecting. Of course the lines aren't straight. I had considered using a banana to actually illustrate this, but you get the point. So the three theories I want to outline. The first is what you can call the economic or economics theory. So we have an X and a Y axis. Y traditionally, I believe, is the vertical axis. And on this axis, what you have is the health or otherwise of the economy. At the very top, you have an economy of plenty. These are the boom times. Everything's going great. There's work for all, there's housing for all, there's support for those who might be left behind. And at the bottom, you have an economy in free fall, already bumping along the bottom. Some of us have seen this for a while. But here you have long-standing decay, damage, neglect of the infrastructure. There's no resources to do anything. And there are a lot of people who find themselves at the bottom of this tree or line or whatever it is. So along the x-axis we have homelessness. Many kinds of homelessness are after all, and in a more detailed version of this, if I could do that, I'd probably need more fingers, you might have gradations of homelessness, but I'm looking particularly at chronicity. People who are temporarily homeless, people who are insecurely housed, and people who are really deeply entrenched in lifestyle homelessness. Now, it's harder to measure this, and we tend to measure homelessness by the statistics of people using services or other socio-demographic means, because demographic surveys and so on aren't easy to do with this population. So this isn't going to lend itself to a graph very, very precisely, not as precisely as economic measures would do, but this is a conceptual thing. This is an idea rather than an actual graph. And actually, even when we look at economies as a whole, measures like GDP are, well, we know how unevenly distributed the wealth in any one economy can be. So you're going to have to look at a number of different indices for health of the economy. I'm looking at it principally in terms of the lifestyle and the life chances of the individuals in there, rather than measures of the wealth of the nation as a whole, because we know that that's not all that relevant to the lives of ordinary people. When you have an economy where 1% of the population own huge amounts of the wealth and are resistant as well to funding any of the services below, there are cultural differences here. So cultures, attitudes, emotions do come into this picture. They do come into play in terms of understanding the issues that we see. In particular, I think one economist by the name of Amartya Sen, who some people will know of, has written a lot about what he's called adaptive preferences, which is the argument that people typically will adapt their ideas about what they hope for, what their aspirations are, to what's actually realistically within their scope of what they can get. It's just too painful to hope for things and to want things that are way, way, way out of your range. It's all very well for Disney to talk about following your dream and so on, but people actually don't usually pursue it that far. You actually adjust your dreams as to what you might want according to your actual life circumstances. So those issues do come into play But these are really still quite economically rational issues. Mental health as such, although it is an aspect of vulnerability that we'll address later, it's primarily seen as secondary to see people's economic circumstances. They might self-medicate and cause themselves additional difficulties. Certainly there's an awful lot of stress involved in insecurity and in homelessness, and you can't get on with life. But these are secondary to the economic reality. They compound the situation, but the real problem is the state of the economy. And the damage done to individuals that you might try and limit is really another further aspect of the damage and the decay of the infrastructure. People are seen as economic entities and wasted. So that's one way of looking at the causes and the origins of homelessness. And certainly if you're looking at the huge growth of homelessness in the last few years in the UK, for example, you'd have to say that cuts in benefits have had a major impact, and the failure of the economy to survive after years of austerity. But there is another way of looking at it. According to the economics theory, it can happen to anyone. Anyone can fall through the nets. Anyone could end up at the bottom of that of that line. The other way of looking at this is to say, yes, but we do need to look at the vulnerability. Some people were vulnerable, are particularly vulnerable, struggle to keep themselves above water, and struggle then to get back out when they fall through. So here, our y-axis is about the health of the individual rather than the health of the economy. At the very top of the axis, we've got the shiny, happy people. These are the ones that Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization was about. These ones are creative, getting on with things in their life. They also have matters of social capital. They have friends. They have people you can turn to. They have enriching and rewarding relationships with everybody, it seems. Whereas down at the bottom of this particular version of the y-axis, you have people with very poor mental health, not necessarily outright mental illness, but people who have huge problems in living, dysfunctional behaviour, self-defeating relationships, and attitudes to match. It's not just the behaviour, it's also the way you think about the world. These people are often quite alienated and alienating, and we sometimes call them hard to engage, although it's a phrase we prefer to say is the problem of the services rather than the individuals. But you'll often find a lot of distrust of services, a lot of despair, very poor self-image, difficulties in the family, perhaps that may make that person more likely to fall through nets. But an alienation and erosion of that social capital that is protective for so many people. So here we'll have a graph where the economic graph has more and more people falling through as the economy gets into better or worse shape. Here, using my chopstick as a graph indicator, you have the people who are more likely to fall through the nets would be, and end up, this bottom axis is still around homelessness. Obviously we can, if I had enough fingers to do this, we could see how they're not as incompatible as they may seem. A lot of the rhetoric of these services tends to go in different directions, but the people at the bottom are pretty much the same either way. So that's two different versions, two different models of how people end up homeless temporarily or mired in entrenched homelessness. But there is a third, and for this I only need one. The Swiss cheese model of accidents and risk was developed, I believe, originally in the air traffic industry, where they have to identify how accidents happen. I believe it's also used in other areas of security, like computer security these days, where people can penetrate through a number of different defences. But this is really all about falling through the net. The fail-safes fail to save an individual. You have a whole string of different nets and safety nets, And in air traffic accidents or many other forms of accident, it's just bad luck. If you happen to, or not you, but a plane, if you happen to fall through, a whole lot of fail-safes have to fail all at the same moment for you to fall through all those nets, all those holes in the nets. If there are safety nets in place and if they are robust enough, then rather than falling through, the individual meets one of the fail-safes and they bounce back. They get back into the swirl of life, the ebbs and flows and so on, but they aren't particularly damaged or entrenched or locked into whatever it is that they've fallen through. If not, they may fall through one net and another net, but still there's another one that may catch them. It's only if they're all aligned together. And that's why for some people falling through the net can be very, very rapid indeed. But for others, it's a much slower process of pinging to and fro, perhaps, and getting stuck in some kind of intermediate, not fully out, not fully in yet. So that's partly a question of how many nets there are and how robust there are. It's also partly a reflection of how steep the fall is as people fall through the nets. But it's partly about how well joined up the various different support services may actually be or may need to be. And if the gaps cluster in a particular area, that's the area where people are most likely to fall through. So, there's our three principal theories: the economic theory, the vulnerability theory, and the Swiss cheese theory of risk and luck. What's the significance of these three different theories for the experience of ending up homeless and for the experience that homelessness services must engage and must work with? Well, if you take primarily the economic theory, what people primarily need is practical help. They're going to need a roof over their night. They're going to need that bottom Maslow hierarchy of needs. They're going to need those needs met. They're going to need maybe some help and advice to get back into the swing of things. Help with benefits, maybe some kind of specialist voucher system, for example, for people to get back into the housing market. And they might need referral on, in some cases, to other services that can help. But if they're needing referral on, it's because that's what every citizen has the right to. This is not to do with you being homeless. Homelessness is just a temporary circumstance, but anybody has a right to other services. So if there's any psychology involved in this at all, it's about citizenship. It's about some kind of pride and self-respect. You would probably be drawing on broadly a humanistic psychology approach, which is about values, aspiration, what people find meaningful in their lives. So in effect, the strengths model, which is one of the aspects, at least as I see it, one of the aspects of humanistic psychology, which is saying, let's not look at what this person can't do, let's not look at them in terms of their deficits, but let's look at them in terms of their strengths and their potential for recovery. At all costs, what you would not do is add to a poor self-image and compound the stigma with which people are already quite likely to be seeing themselves by talking about their particular vulnerability and how in some ways they may be the architects of their own misfortune. Because mental health is seen as secondary, you might want, of course, to be referring people on, but the primary focus is on them as citizens with rights. The case for developing support services here is primarily an economic case. You want to get people back on their feet as soon as possible after a blip on the screen. You could say that there are some cost savings from damage limitation, that person hasn't got stuck into a dysfunctional lifestyle that will then mean that they have other, cause other difficulties to that costs the state. But effectively you're arguing that as fast as possible we want to get this person back into being a productive citizen and out of their run of bad luck. Because it can happen to anyone. Anyone can fall through those nets. The alternative theory, what I've called the vulnerability approach, focuses instead on the levels of poor mental health that we do tend to find in this population. And it's mental health problems that on the whole mental health services do not see, or certainly don't effectively engage with them, which is why they don't see them. So we'd be talking about the areas where homelessness services can develop skills and processes for engaging people that other services have been unable to do. We need to talk about the particular skills that services have developed. So, for example, the pre-treatment approach that Jay Levy has talked about, which is all about getting where this individual client is at, is much more person-centered, this whole approach. And you have to be very careful about engagement, forming a relationship with somebody who's going to be fairly distrustful, going to be fairly wary. So again, humanistic psychology particularly useful here, particularly the stress on relationships, the importance of relationships as starting to engage and recover. And again, the skills of engagement that Jay Levy has talked about, and which we've described as being central to developing a psychologically informed environment. So the whole environment helps you in encouraging and developing engagement. It's particularly easy to make a case for the vulnerability thesis if you have a more specialist service for people working specifically with people who come through the mental health services, care leavers, for example, women, anybody escaping domestic violence, arguably ex-offenders. But the key thing is, when the issues around personal vulnerability, you don't necessarily know in advance what this person's life experience has been, what things there may be lurking in their history and their biography. So you have to have the skills and the processes ready to engage, to effectively engage anybody, and to identify and tease out what it is in particular they need. You might want to be deliberately addressing the social structure of your organisation, the kind of things that you get people involved with. So you develop what we call social therapy, a set of roles that allow people to grow into a new role or a new status, things like peer mentoring and being on service user scrutiny board or whatever. The economic case is still largely one of breaking the cycle and of damage limitation. The savings here are probably to other health or other services such as the prison, A&E of course, as well as the mental health services. And there could be a case for saying this is a public health issue. It's not a secondary mental health issue where the specialists are, frankly, they're not necessarily of much use. Sometimes not unless they've readjusted their way of thinking to work with a population they don't normally see. But you could be looking at a public health case in terms of the health of the community as a whole, and there's certainly potentially a case for arguing for additional support, more specialist support staff working with the homelessness services. A couple of other things you might be particularly interested in, granted the vulnerable persons making contact at last with a support service that can help them, is around continuity. We know a lot about attachment and risk and how attachment difficulties can be related to trauma in early life. And one of the implications of this is that you might want to be particularly concerned to ensure decent time for handover, ongoing involvement, and respecting the trust that people develop with perhaps the first worker. They really talk too much about things. So that's the vulnerability thesis as applied in the homelessness, say. The third area that we've looked at is the Swiss cheese model. Now here you have to be completely open-minded as to what the person's previous history has been before they arrive in the service. It's important when somebody is vulnerable because you don't know how far back that vulnerability may go. But with the Swiss cheese model, you really don't know how many nets or holes in the net the person has fallen through. You may particularly want to have specialist support available as need be, but your whole service may not be presupposing vulnerability and support needs in that way. You particularly perhaps want to have very good links with other agencies that you can bring in, not just so much that you can refer to, but that you can bring in and work with. Co-working is often particularly valuable for this client group, as it would be for any, of course. For the client, perhaps having fallen through, you may feel rather aggrieved. It may feel that it was just bad luck on your part. You may feel that you're the victim, you're the architect of your own bad luck. So there's all kinds of complex ambivalences around the Swiss cheese model that services need to address. One thing we can particularly say is that you don't want to necessarily stress people's deficits, because sometimes they've fallen through just through an unlucky roll of the dice. People don't necessarily want to be repeating their story to every person that they encounter as they move through, and they would prefer things were a bit more joined up, and actually that is quite central. You might well be the first person to really engage this person, but nevertheless, your service is one of many that they've been through. You're not necessarily the centre of their world. You are a part of their trajectory through life. And although it's important that you play your role in a constructive way as possible, you don't want to be hanging on to that individual for any longer than you need to. That would be particularly true of youth services, where youth is a period of transience and people can move on. Although, of course, young people who find themselves homeless will often have fallen through particular family nets, and you may be the first family or peer group that they properly feel safe with. So working out exactly how to get that balance right is quite a sophisticated task. You do really want to be engaging with other community support, so identifying pathways through your service and identifying ways in which you can work with other agencies, and that's part of trying to get a better joined up service, so there are fewer nets, and when people do fall through the nets, they can bounce back out faster. There is an economic case, perhaps, for better communications between agencies, for more efficient referral, and for better engagement when somebody does come through to you. But in particular, I think the responsibility of services will be to inform commissioners and to inform other agencies of where the gaps and where the barriers are. You may have to be prepared to go that extra mile and help fill in those gaps with your own staff and your own time. Because if until the gap is closed, you are the person holding the baby. So a little extra flexibility, perhaps on behalf of services, is called for using this Swiss cheese model. But certainly liaising with other agencies, getting better referral mechanisms in and out of your service, and more effective co-working, those are all key areas that the Swiss cheese model would suggest we should look at. So the central issue in the economic model is it can happen to anyone. Let's get them out there as fast as possible. The central issue in vulnerability is something like a stitch in time. If you can catch that person and meet their needs, you stop them falling through further nets, but you need to be there for them. And the central issue in the Swiss cheese model is perhaps as much around working, it's certainly very much the same stitch in time, but it's as much around issues of working with the gaps and working with the pathways in and out and through services. So we've got our two different models. There's the economic and there's the vulnerability, and of course the Swiss cheese model adds in all these different levels. It's a bit difficult to do this with chopsticks in the end, but I hope at least I've used them in such a way as to shed some light, perhaps, on different ways of thinking about the issues and what it is that homelessness services are actually doing. Oh, what I may try and do is to convert some of this into images that we can put in an actual proper written article, because I think it is in principle a good idea to get these ideas out in a way that a video won't necessarily do. But it was just an irresistible opportunity to try it.